Carlos was never someone who believed in love at first sight. To him, the idea of a predestined encounter always seemed like a naive fantasy. After a few disappointing romantic experiences, he decided to focus on work and friends. However, at the insistence of a colleague, he downloaded a dating app without high expectations, just to see what might happen. He never imagined that it would change his life. It was a typical Friday night when he received a notification from the app. Carlos's heart sped up a bit when he saw the photo of a woman named Isabela. She had a captivating smile and eyes that seemed to hide deep secrets. Something about her intrigued him immediately. He swiped right, and to his surprise, they matched. The conversation started casually, but quickly evolved into something more. They talked about movies, books, and even dreams they had never shared with others. After a few days of exchanging messages, they decided to meet. They chose a cozy cafe in the city center. When Carlos arrived and saw her for the first time, he was speechless. Isabela was even more charming in person. She had a magnetic presence, and he couldn't take his eyes off her. They spent hours talking, as if time simply didn't exist. Everything flowed so naturally that it felt like they had known each other for years. The meetings became frequent. With each encounter, Carlos felt more involved. Isabela was different from anyone he had ever met. She was intelligent, funny, and had an aura of mystery that left him intrigued. At the same time, there was something in her eyes that Carlos couldn't decipher. It was as if she was hiding something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. Despite all the connection, some things began to bother him. Isabela always seemed to know where he was, even when he didn't tell her. She would send messages asking if he was at a certain place, and he was surprised to realize that she was right, even though he hadn't mentioned where he would be. At first, Carlos thought it was just a coincidence, but these coincidences began to happen more frequently, and he started to feel uncomfortable. One night, while they were at Carlos's apartment, Isabela made a comment that gave him chills. "I always knew we would meet, Carlos. From the moment I first saw you, I knew you were the man I had been waiting for." Carlos tried to smile, but something in her tone of voice unsettled him. "What do you mean?" "We met through the app. It was a casual thing," he replied, trying to understand what she meant. "For you, maybe," she said, with an enigmatic smile. "But for me, it was inevitable." Carlos tried not to give much importance to the comment, but it kept nagging at his mind. In the days that followed, he began to notice other strange details. Isabela seemed to know things about him that he had never mentioned. She knew his routine, his habits, even details about his childhood that he didn't remember sharing. This left him confused and, at the same time, fascinated. Then suddenly, Isabela disappeared. Carlos tried to contact her, but all attempts were in vain. She didn't answer the phone, didn't reply to messages, and her social media accounts were inactive. Worried, he went to her apartment, but there was no sign of life. He knocked on the door repeatedly, but no one answered. He asked the neighbors, but they all seemed unaware of who he was talking about. "Isabela? I don't know anyone by that name around here," said an elderly neighbor, with a suspicious look. Carlos was completely confused. He was certain that it was her apartment. He clearly remembered dropping her off there several times after their meetings. He began to question whether he was losing his mind, but the memories of the moments they had spent together were too vivid to be a figment of his imagination. He was determined to find out what was happening. He visited the cafe where they used to meet and asked the waiter about Isabela. To his surprise, the waiter seemed uncomfortable when he heard her name. "Look, I remember you coming here several times, but always alone," said the waiter, frowning. "I never saw you with anyone." Carlos felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. How was that possible? He remembered Isabela beside him, talking, laughing, living moments together. But now, it seemed that no one else had seen her. He began to doubt his own sanity. Even so, Carlos didn't give up. He decided to go to the building where he believed Isabela lived and, after much persistence, managed to get in. When he reached the apartment, the door was slightly ajar. Hesitantly, he pushed the door open and entered. What he saw left him speechless. The apartment was dusty, as if no one had lived there for years. However, there were photos of Isabela scattered around the room. The photos, however, seemed old from a much earlier time. Exploring the place, Carlos found a diary in a drawer. As he flipped through it, he realized that the diary belonged to a woman named Isabela, but the last entries were from more than 50 years ago. His heart raced when he saw that on the last page, the words, "I will find you, Carlos," were written by hand. With the diary in hand, Carlos left the apartment, stunned. As he descended the stairs, he heard footsteps behind him. He quickly turned around, and there was Isabela, with the same enigmatic smile as always. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, with a soft voice that contrasted with the dark expression in her eyes. Carlos tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that everything he had discovered about Isabela was true, and that she was not an ordinary person. "You were destined for me, Carlos. No matter what you do, no matter where you go, we will always meet." He took a step back, panic taking over his body. He tried to rationalize what was happening, but nothing made sense. Isabela took a step toward him, her eyes shining with something he couldn't understand. "See you soon," she whispered, before disappearing into the darkness of the hallway. Carlos was paralyzed for a moment, not knowing if what had just happened was real or a product of his imagination. When he finally managed to move, he ran out of the building, the diary still in his hands. He drove aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But the more he thought about it, the more confusing things became. In the days that followed, Carlos tried to resume his life, but nothing seemed normal anymore. He constantly felt watched, as if someone was always lurking. Isabela's diary remained stored in his drawer, but he never had the courage to open it again. Every night, before sleeping, he wondered, was all that just a dream? Or was Isabela still around, waiting to reunite with him? The questions continued to torment him. He began to avoid going out, afraid of meeting Isabela again. Even so, in his nightmares, she was always there, with that mysterious smile, promising that they would meet again. Carlos knew that, somehow, his life had changed forever. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Isabela's presence would never leave him in peace. No matter what he did, she would always be there, in the dark corners of his mind, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself again. With each passing day, Carlos found himself more trapped in his own thoughts, unable to distinguish reality from illusion. He tried to talk to friends about what was happening, but no one took him seriously. His life had turned into a spiral of doubts and fears, and he began to question everything he had lived through until then. Deep down, Carlos knew that the answer was in the diary, but he couldn't summon the courage to open it again. Something inside him told him that if he did, there would be no turning back. And then, he would remain forever trapped in the web of mystery that Isabela had woven around him. And so, Carlos continued his life, or what was left of it, trying to avoid the inevitable. But he knew, deep down, that no matter how much he tried to run, Isabela would be there waiting. She would always be waiting. And one day, maybe he would finally have to face the frightening truth about who, or what, Isabela really was. But until then, he would live with the constant fear that, at any moment, she might reappear and finish what she had started.